For our viewers, I would like to introduce you to Professor Aner Govrin, who is a psychoanalyst and a philosopher and clinical psychologist. He's also the director of a doctoral track in psychoanalysis in the program for hermeneutics and cultural studies at Bar Ilan University in Israel. And he's also a member of the faculty of the Tel Aviv Institute for Contemporary Psychoanalysis. And he also has a private practice in Tel Aviv. Today we're going to be talking about one of his recent books. It's called Ethics and Attachment, and it's generated a great deal of interest in the field. And just to mention that this is just one of several of Professor Govrin's books, yet this is getting a great deal of attention immediately, especially given that his theory on ethics has generated a wide amount of downloads from the journal called Frontiers in Psychology. In fact, he published a paper in 2014 that was the basis of this book called The ABCs of Moral Development. And it's received over 20,000 views and downloads today, and is one of the most popular articles that exist in that journal. So we're delighted to have you, Aner, and so nice to see you again. Listen, you coined the term the attachment approach to how we make moral judgments. Can you give us an overview of your theory?
First of all, thank you, John, for inviting me here. It's a pleasure being with you and talking to you on my theory. The theory, it's called, as you said, the attachment approach to moral judgment. I've been working on it for, I think, about nearly 20 years from now. And it took me time to develop the theory, and and the book was published 2 years ago. And first of all, I thought there is a strong need for a new moral psychology, because if you look at the field, you can see that there are two philosophical traditions that are been here for hundreds of years. And one of it, it's called sentimentalism, which means that moral is basically about emotions. And the second is about rationalism, which says that simply that moral judgment is about higher order cognitive processes when you judge and think a lot about the problem. And the two traditions clash, and the moral psychologies actually follow these two traditions, and they made a binary, a dichotomy between emotion and cognition. And each moral psychology thought that it should be loyal to one of these traditions. And I think that that's where moral psychology has been stuck, because they didn't really think about what characterized specifically our moral judgment capacity, our ethics, our capacity to just right-wrong judgment. I mean, emotion is too general. It's too general, and rationalize and cognition is too general. A lot of domains can be included in this, and they didn't tell you what is the specificity of our moral judgment. And that's where my theory wants to fill this lacune. What it basically says is that moral judgment is, there is something that is unite all moral situations. There is like a deep structure within all moral situations. And it doesn't really matter if the moral situation is about robbery or murder or negligence or a political fight between two nations. There is something that unites all moral situations. These features that unite all moral situation are part of their structure of moral situation, and that is how we easily identify, recognize that it's a moral situation and not some general social situation. And in my theory, I actually I actually say what these features are. You know, many people say that moral judgment, they know now today that moral judgment is fast, is effortlessly, we rapidly know with no thinking the moral judgment itself. And my theory asks, how do we do that? How do we open the newspaper, see cases about robbery, about murder, about bribe, and immediately know what is the right-wrong judgment? Immediately know that there is a moral failure there. How do we do that so quickly? How do we have this capacity? How do we find out about that? And my theory said that something happens in those milliseconds when we read the newspaper and before the judgment appears. And what happened is that we find a deep structure within all moral situations. And I can briefly tell you what is this deep structure. And first of all, we find a dyad. So every moral situation there is an observer that is viewing, that has to tell something about a dyad, about two parties in conflict. That's the most basic feature of moral situation. And that was actually empirically found by Kurt Gray, who found out that moral situations are about agents and patients, are about two people in conflict or two parties in conflict. It doesn't matter if it's two groups. It can be the Nazis and the Jews. It can be 10 thieves and one old lady. We always find the core unit is always two parties in conflict, even though the party can be many individuals or a whole nation. So if you take different cases, if you take negligence, if you take robbery, if you take theft, whatever you take, you'll find you have to view two parties in conflict. And now you have to make decisions, some decisions about the two. Yeah? The viewer, the observer, needs to evaluate these two parties in conflict and think what happened between them. And so we go on to think about a very important component of the two. We try to find who is the weak and who is the strong, who is dependent and who is independent, who is helpless and who is in control. In short, we try to find who is the child and who is the adult. And once we decide that, and I'll tell you later, we get into that, how do we do that? How we decide who is the child and who is the adult? But once we decide it, we now turn our expectations to the adult side. And the only thing that we care about is how did the adult behaved or misbehaved toward the child, and we compare this to our expectations of how adults should or should not behave towards children or infants. And then we evaluate our expectations, the actual behavior vis-a-vis our expectation. And when we find that he violated our expectations, that's how we know that it is a moral failure. So moral failure is actually a violation of our previous expectation. this is really, in general, how we make moral judgments.
So just to clarify, so in any situation that we would deem to be an ethical situation, where we're going to make judgments about right and wrong, we're in some ways, whether it be consciously or unconsciously, attuned to power differentials, and we would identify who is the person in control, and whether or not that person is in some ways violating someone else or a group that's seen as more dependent or helpless. Is that true?
Exactly. We watch carefully the adult, and we think, what did he do to the childlike party? And then we have all the information, and we have, you know, it's very quick. It doesn't go into our conscious. We don't need to think this is a childlike, this is an adult-like, or this is strong, this is weak. Everything goes so rapidly. It's like a snapshot judgment, you know, it just pops up into our mind because it's really about perception more than about a judgment.
So maybe just to try to give us some context or example, like the recent rioting in the United States, where Donald Trump had incited sedition, where his base marched on, you know, the Capitol. And you see these images in, you know, in the world news, where the rioters are storming the Capitol, and various guards and police personnel are responding to the mob. What can you break it down? Like, what do you think we're focusing on there?
Of course. So first of all, the expression "break it down" is very appropriate here, because we always break down the moral situation into its unit or its basic components. So what happened in the Capitol Hill is actually, I think it's a good example of a complicated moral situation. I mean, the situation I talked about, first I gave you the basic thing. How do we know that a robbery is right or wrong? Yes, how do we know that a murder is right or wrong? We break it down to, let's say, let's start with a simple example, then we'll get to the Capitol Hill and what happened there.
Sure.
Let's get a simple example of a doctor a surgeon who left the surgery in the middle because he had tickets to the opera. Okay, that's a very simple situation. We quickly know that there are two parties, the surgeon and the patient, and we know that he behaved violating our expectation. That's not how surgeons should behave towards their patients, right? Surgeons have responsibility. They are strong. The patient is weak, is helpless. He's putting his life into the surgeon's hands, and so we have no problem to understand that. In the case of a Capitol Hill, it's an example of something that is much more complicated. There are many parties here, and the data is extremely, you know, there is a lot of data that we have to, and it depends on who is the viewer. Is the viewer a Trump supporter, or is the viewer is a Democrat supporter? So if the viewer is a Trump supporter, it's also, you know, it's I think the most difficult, the huge conflict is about Trump supporters, because the Democrats, it's very simple. And when you see, for example, today we saw a policeman being beaten by those demonstrators, and it is a shocking scene where you see dozens of supporters and demonstrators beat with sticks, actually a defenseless policeman. And here you can see the moral situation as I describe it, one against many. He's defenseless, there are many. He has a gun, but he doesn't shoot. And you can, everyone was shocked by it. Whether you're a liberal or whether you are a Trump supporter, everyone was shocked by these scenes. But when you get deep inside, you see more complicated thing. I'll give you an example. If Twitter, let's say I'm looking at it from a Trump supporter, okay? Now Twitter banned Trump and they want to impeach Trump and maybe make a move that he will not be able to be a candidate once again to the presidency. Now, some people say it's not wise to do, because when you do that, you might turn Trump into a victim. The whole system is against him, and the whole strong administration and congressmen are against him. And so now he turns to be weak, he turns to be victim. He doesn't have much to say about it because that's their decision. And that might bring him more supporters, actually, because now people will come to defend him and his rights. So what you might do is to alienate those people who thought that it was not right to do and they were against Trump. Now, when you make of him a victim, you might alienate these supporters that you might have and make him a victim. And what you do is create a movement that will be strong to support him. And so what you see is that it's always where the viewer think who is the victim and who is the perpetrator. That's the real thing. And it's what I'm saying is it's something we compute it in our mind. We compute it in our mind. You see, Trump can be a bully, but for some viewers, for some observers, he can turn out to be a victim again, from bully to victim. So these viewers might support him actually, and it might give him much strength for his power, political power. So it might be dangerous.
So, yeah, I realize I threw a wrench in when I asked that question because it's too complicated. But from what you said, is it fair to say that your approach is to really take a perspectival approach? It's all based upon the agent viewing a scene. And so, of course, the agent viewing a certain behavioral scene that's from the standpoint of a Trump supporter versus antithetical to that would have different perceptions of reality.
Exactly. First of all, yes. So first of all, let me say that this is not a normative theory, but a descriptive theory. I'm really interested in one thing: what goes in the mind of the viewer, of the observer. That's all I'm interested in. I don't have any claims about what is right or what is wrong, although there are some implication about that from my theory. But let me go a step further, because I said that it's all about seeing who is the weak and who is the strong, and the expectations, directing the expectations toward the strong. But we know that it's not so simple. If it was so simple, we didn't have so much, we wouldn't have so much moral controversies and bitter ones sometimes. So what makes it so messy? If we are all alike, if all people do the same thing, compute in the same manner all moral situation, why are we so different? Why is the world so messy regarding moral situations? And Trump and what happened in the Capitol Hill is one example, but there are many other examples. For example, death penalty and abortion. These are all moral controversies, unresolved, with people that are against each other. So how is it that we do the same cognitive process and we reach so different solution and so contrasting judgments? And the answer is it's all about the observer. It's all about the judge. So what I'm saying is that everyone does the same thing. Everyone, when we see a moral situation, when moral situation is presented to our mind, everyone does the same thing. Find a dyad, find two parties in conflict, decide who is the strong and who is the weak, who is the child and who is the adult, and direct the expectation toward the adult. But that is just a process. It says little about the content because everything is observer relative. I mean, for me, party A will be the child and party B will be the adult. But for someone else, it will be the opposite. And so there is no agreement who is the child and who is the adult. So how do we decide who is the child? Who are we for? Who is the victim? It all depends on our identity, on our, I call it, the like me criterion. So first of all, people, it depends on our attachment to the victim and our attachment to the perpetrator. It depends on our attachment to each of the parties. For example, the like me criterion is that people who are like me, I will be more likely to be in their side than against them. So if they are the perpetrators, I'll be less likely to see it. For example, if there is, let's say, a robbery, yes? What would the robbery has a mother? Of course, she will not say that her son is the perpetrator and the old lady that is the victim. Of course, she knows that, but she wouldn't identify with the old lady. She might have many excuses why her son did that. For her, it is her son, not a perpetrator. And we can say that that's a very blunt example, but we can say it about, my own group, my own ethnic group, my own religious group. So what I'm saying is the observer is engaged with each of the parties emotionally. And if you tell people that there is, just something from the newspaper, a robbery, there was a robber a young man who robbed an old lady, just like that, with no details, you really distance the observer from, so everyone will say the same thing, that it is wrong, he shouldn't have done it, he deserved a harsh penalty, etc. But when you start telling the observers who are the parties, he's starting to attach to each of the parties. And this attachment, this engagement with each of the parties, it will decide, it will determine his moral judgment. So what I'm saying is that the like me criterion is a very strong component of our final moral judgment. That's what I've said. That you asked me about the riots in the Capitol. It depends who is the observer. Is it an extreme left? Is it an extreme right? Is it a liberal? Is it a Democrat? Is it Trump supporters? So what I'm saying is that everyone does the same thing when presented a moral judgment. Find out the dyad, decide who is the child and who is the adult, and direct the expectation toward the adult. But the content will be different.
Mhm.
Let's take, for example, the abortion controversy. Okay, so for pro-life, the victim is the embryo, right? The embryo, and it is a defenseless victim, a human-like victim, which the mother, the pregnant mother, and the state that permits her wants to kill. So his heart goes to the embryo, that's the victim. And the adult-like is the state and the mother. But for the pro-choice supporter, the woman is the victim. The pregnant woman, whether because she's poor, she can't afford another child, maybe she was raped. For all sorts of reasons, she doesn't want to have that baby. And the state prohibits her to do it. Does not allow her to do it. So the state is the perpetrator, is the adult, and the woman is the victim. So what you can see from this example is they're both doing the same thing, the same cognitive processes. But because it's observer relative, they identify the child and the adult with different sides. And that's why they have that's why they don't agree on it.
Well, let me try to distill this.
You can see how the content is different from the process.
So on one hand, it seems like that you are starting from the standpoint of the individual that commits that to their unique psychological perception and projection and expectation of events based upon their identification with either a certain person or a group or a value system that stands in relation to others. So you're introducing a perspectivalism on one level, but it's also relative to both the individual's unique, subjective psychologies, as well as potentially a form of relativism, where it is based upon how one subjectively analyzes a unique situation. And then at the same time, you're introducing the notion of a universality, that all human beings are going to be making, from at least from a process-oriented point of view or a structural point of view, going to be making these kinds of cognitive yet unconscious operations. So on one hand, you have kind of a radical subjective relativity, or at least potentially so. And on the other hand, you're highlighting the notion of a universality, or what we might call as an objective form that's fueling the process of decision making. Now, if that's true, then if that's the case, how do you reconcile your theory with, let's say, the classical divide between relativism, as there's really no ultimate objective truth. No one else's experience can ever trump mine, because I have these unique experiences and identifications and beliefs and values and attitudes, versus the other notion that isn't there some kind of moral absolute out there, some kind of objective moral realism that exists. And it seems like you're trying to address both sides. Is that fair to say?
I think it's very fair to say. I think any moral psychology has to answer this question. How is it that morality is both subjective and subjective? How is it that it's both seems to us to be true and non-negotiable, and at the same time, when we look at the world, it seems so messy, so capricious, and so diverse between people, between nations, between societies? And I think my theory gives a good answer to this dilemma, to explain both sides. What it basically says is, there is a common morality. There is a common morality. It is that we all agree that there are things that adults should not and should do towards children or children-like. You know, it started with parents in our evolution, it's probably started with the mother or the parents to the infant, but then it expanded to, and many populations and people can be represented by an adult or an infant. And I think there is a total agreement, a universal, objective, total agreement that adults should take care of infants or children and not the other way around, that adults are responsible to children, that children are weak and defenseless. It's part of our evolutionary system, you know, children are cute and they arouse a lot of positive feelings and empathic feelings. And adults should protect them and should provide them what they need and certainly should not harm them. I think there is a universal agreement, and this is about that in all cultures. And this is the objective, hardcore objectives of our morality. And I think that we have we agree about a lot of things, And you know, when there are disagreements, it's not about the basics. For example, if a thief comes to trial, and there is a proof that he did do that, there was a theft. So we like start to compute what happened between the two. So the prosecutor tells us that this wasn't the first time he did it, and he will show how he behaved toward the victim. Perhaps it was an old lady, it was her social security, monthly allowance that he took, and she was so poor. And the defense will like to see that he is also a victim. The thief is also a victim. He had a harsh childhood, and maybe he has a family to support with no money. So they're really struggling on how the judge or how the jury will construe the dyad between them. Once the dyad that the jury will see that the thief is also a victim, to emphasize the childlike features of the thief. And the prosecutions want to do the other way around. But you see, there is an agreement between them that it was wrong what he did. There is also agreement that if everyone agrees that he is a poor man, and there was reasons out of his, good reasons for him to do that theft, and he is really poor, and if everyone would believe that, there will be less harsh penalty. So there is a lot of agreement between them, the parties. They're not, nobody's saying, look, even if he beat the old women, even if he was cruel to the old man, it's okay to be cruel to the old woman. No one will say that. There is a lot of agreement that cruelty to the old woman is wrong. And the question is, will the jury or the judge will be convinced about the victimhood of the thief? So there is a lot of computing. We really detect, there is a computation there. It's like we have a computer that you know, adds the features, the childlike feature, and adds the adult-like feature of each side, and then make a whole gestalt. But there is a lot of things that they are agreement in. So what I'm saying, if back to your question, is that the morality is both. There is a part that is objective, and there is a part that is subjective. How we build it, the cognitive platform is objective. We do the same things, and there is an agreement about the cognitive platform. No one says, no, it's the old lady that is to be blamed, not the thief. No one says it. It's that everything is directed to have, to be disgusted and feel bad about what he did to the old lady. Every one of us. No one will turn around and say, no, the old lady is to be blamed. But how you compute it, how you, the emotional engagement to each of the party is different between us. And that's why the messy thing, that's why it looks so messy. That is the subjective part of the dyad. That is why we're so capricious in our moral judgments. And actually, that's why we need the law. Yes, so one of the main function of the law is to tell you, it doesn't matter if you dislike this person, or if you see him as an adult-like or child-like. In a democracy, everyone has rights. There are laws how you should behave. We are not putting it to your responsibility. We take it from you, and there is a law that prevents people to be capricious about how they deal how they manage their daily life, and how the society is ordered and structured. So I think one of the merits of my theory, if I may say so, is that exactly what you say, that it explains how in our mind we have both components, objective and subjective.
I'm trying to put it in the context of, given that there's so many divisions in the world, so much polarization, so much splitting, so much disrecognition of the other, that, my first book was on prejudice, and the thought is that unconsciously we form dialectical identifications with certain groups and ideas and values and cultures that are modeled based upon our early childhood, based upon identifications with our parents, their values, our community. And this is before I got into the attachment literature. It seems that though you're getting at some very basic building blocks of these divisions, and that is emotionally mediated in that moment. And it probably happens in a fraction of a second that people make these judgments. So that has to be emotively and cognitively, mediated, based upon identifications with the values, where there are judgments of right and wrong, even when they become complex. And yet there's an acknowledgement of the subjectivity about it, but because it's universal, it's a subjective universality, which makes it objective in the sense that all human beings are oriented toward this stance. Now, if that's the case, if I've accurately described that, what happens if a person, what happens if a person has ambivalent identifications with the two parties that that you've just mentioned, like it depends on the shift of perspective, but usually we're going to identify with the group that's like me, as you put it, or I want to be like a certain group because I aspire to that value system. But what happens when you're ambivalent? Or what happens when you're under the influence of psychopathology? So, I mean, like extreme forms of hate for the other, extreme forms of prejudice. Wouldn't that be a distortion of the universal ethic that you're promulgating?
That's a very good question. But before I answer that, I want to say something about what you say about attachment. Why is it so universal? Why is it so objective? And in my book, my main thesis is that we, by the age of 1 year, we all have the basic capacities to judge right, wrong judgments. It's before we know how to speak. And how is that? How did we acquire this? So the theory goes like that. It's similar. There is something similar between this and language acquisition. And it's both innate and learned. So we have the basic mechanism to find the dyad and to know who is weak and who is strong. It is innate, but in order it to be activated, we need to participate in the early interactions with our caregiver. And so this dyad, yes, that there is weak and strong, dependent and independent, is really something that we all went through. Because when we were born, we were helpless. We were defenseless. We were cute. We had to be taken care of in order to live. And each one of us, because we're living, this means that someone took care of us. Even if it was a bad or abusive parent, someone took care of us enough that we are now living. Someone feeds us. Someone gave us medicine when we were ill. So we come to the social world as adults with already much experience with this dyad of dependent and independent, because we once was part of it. And that's how we know what to expect from adults. That's how we know what do victims feel. That's how we know to be empathic to someone. Now, I simplify something that is very complicated, and I really don't know much about how does this happen? How does this really happen? Because there's not much about research about it. But it is something from our own experience and our own non-verbal experience. That's why we don't have to think before we judge a moral situation. We just feel it in our bodies. We just know it. It's much more a perception than a judgment at first, at least at first. So that's the objective universe. And because everyone was born as baby and everyone experienced it in more or less the same manner, that's why we share this knowledge. That's the universal thing, the universal structure. We share the same knowledge of being dependent on someone, of being part of this dyad of dependent-independent relations when we were the dependent. So that's why we know so much about it. And we know so good to judge dyads. And this is really a shared knowledge of all humanity in all times.
I think this is what's unique about your theory, is that you're locating the locus of morality or moral development in an infant. And this is a radical claim because we usually refer to morality or ethics or virtue as something that we acquire over our psychosocial development. It's not something that just would be, evident in an infant. So that in and of itself is so novel and controversial as well, right? But the uniqueness of it is that it's based in an evolutionary attachment paradigm that's largely unconsciously activated, and it becomes the basis for our memories that are associated with good and bad kinds of experiences and qualities, and which would be the basis of how we form expectations about the future. Have I done justice to that?
Exactly. And I'm not saying that, you're right that it's very controversial, because many people, especially sentimentalists, say that it's something that is learned through education. And I think education has a very important role in moral education, but I think it's already educates something that is already existed within the child. The child has already the system that you can educate that system. For example, when I'm saying you think who is weak or who is weak or who is strong, the weak that you will emphasize with, that you will want to defend, is the moral who you take in as a moral population. And that's something to be educated about. For example, the Germans, Nazis, they thought the Jews, although they were objectively weak and defenseless, they just, they didn't care about them. They hated them. They didn't see the Jews that we see, you and me see. They saw an enemy. They saw someone bad. They saw someone that because of them, Germany has lost World War I, and all the things that, the terrible things that Hitler said about Jews. So that is part of education. So the system is already there, but you can manipulate the system. You can take it to many directions. So that's why education is so important.
So then, given how complex it is, it's starting from a simple kind of mechanism, so to speak, that then, as we develop over time through education or life experiences, becomes much more rich and robust and more ambiguous and much more lack of clear-cut distinctions. How do you explain a fundamental ambivalence where you have a dual identification with both parties?
Yes. So many moral psychologists and philosophers have bring dilemmas. The Heinz dilemma of Kohlberg, where there is a pharmacist that Heinz steal a medicine to save his wife. And then there was the trolley dilemma that is very popular today, when there is a train that is going to hit 5 people, and they ask people if they would push a little lever to direct the train, that it will only kill 1 person, but not, and then you save the 5 people. And another situation is if you push a fat man to the train, so it will stop the train, the fat man will be killed, but the 5 people will save. These are all moral dilemmas that I think were occupied philosophers and psychologists, but they're irrelevant to our society. This rarely happens.
Yeah, it seems like just a false analogy that would never happen. It's just intellectual masturbation of some sort. Game theory.
Yes, it's a game. It's something that they want to see what people answer, but these are not real dilemmas from real life. I think the real dilemma is what you say about ambivalence. And ambivalence happens when the parties has both childlike features and adult-like features. Let me give you two examples. There was a famous rapist in Israel, Benny Sela, who was very cruel to women, and he is in jail for life prison, life sentence. And he escaped from the jail. And the whole country was terrorized because of him. Women did not go out to the street because they didn't feel safe while he's outside. And a division, a small unit of policemen caught him and beat him up. And also got some photos with him, beating him up, when you see the policeman smiling and the rapist is wounded. And that is ambivalence. That is ambivalence toward, you see the victim here is also a perpetrator. So our mind slows down when he thinks about this case, and maybe some people, their first response, well, he got beaten, that's great, he deserved it. He deserved it about what he did. But then, or maybe the second response is a more thoughtful response, but I wouldn't want to live in a country where the policeman beat a person. I don't care what he did. And then take photos with him. That's cruel. It's not how it's supposed to be. But you don't feel as though it's an innocent civilian. You know, if it was an innocent citizen, you will feel much more bad about what happened. So you see, this is ambivalence. When people have, when the parties has both childlike features and adult-like features. I'll give you another example. If I tell you that the Air Force bombed a city which was not threatening her borders, and there was no threat from that city, and just ruined the city and killed thousands of civilians, you probably be shocked and say, of course this is a moral failure. But then I'll tell you, you know the city's names? It's Dresden. And the Air Force was the British Air Force, who represent the Allies. And Dresden is part of Nazi Germany, of course. So this is ambivalence here. Of course, these people who died, they shouldn't deserve to die. They are just citizens. There were women and children there among the victims. But what you think of what happened, you take all the World War II there and the Holocaust and the cruelty of the Nazi Germany, and you slow down with your judgment. You just don't exactly know. Our mind is not equipped to operate quickly on those judgments. And of course, the Dresden affair was a very controversial issue because of that. So that's what happens when there is ambivalence. These are the real complicated, serious moral situation that it's hard to make up our minds.
Hiroshima, another example of that. Yeah, I mean, this is where I would imagine that we have more difficulty talking about ethics, virtue theory, moral absolutes, because even if I can agree with the basic structure of your theory, that there has to be some kind of universal process, whereas people are making judgments, and it makes sense that it would be based upon early attachment patterns that would inform the complex relationships that we go through socially. There are so many contextual variances, contingencies, and contents that are so different that to think you would have a ready-made system that could easily apply to any situation is hard to fathom. So it seems like your theory is both trying to talk about an objective universality, at the same time how we constantly are introducing our subjective relativism in situations. Um, Maybe we can end on this final thought I had is given the ambivalence in our relations and our moral experiences, do you have a specific theory of evil?
Well, actually, yes, it's part of my theory, because evil, I see evil as a specific and unique cognition. And it has to do with the theory I just, the attachment approach to moral judgment. First of all, why do we still use the word evil? You know, evil is something that has a religious connotation. You know, evil is Satan. And evil was in the past those people who did not obey God. They were evil. But we still use it. Psychologists don't like the word evil. And because it has a religious connotation, because it's so polarizing, it's so dichotomy, there is dichotomy in this word between bad and good. But people still use it probably because it is functional, because they need the word to describe phenomena that other words don't describe very well. So that's what I thought. What is evil? What does it describe that other words don't describe? And I think it describes a mental state of the observer. It's all about the observer. So it's a perception, and for the observer to say this or that is evil, there are some conditions that should be met. And first of all, there should be an extreme asymmetry between the victim and the perpetrator. This is the first condition, like the Nazis and the Jews, the pedophile and the child, the rapist and his victim. So the asymmetry must be very severe, very salient. Another condition is that it's the observer attributes a certain mental state of the perpetrator to the victim, and about the dependency, how the perpetrator relates to the dependency of the victim. The observer thinks that while for him and for all humanity, dependence evokes feelings of empathy, of tenderness, of wanting you to protect the dependent, the perpetrator, the evil perpetrator, happens to have the opposite feelings. He, the observer, thinks when he sees the dependent, he's indifferent to him, to his suffering, or he intentionally wants to harm him. For example, you know, the ultimate evil is, of course, the Nazis and what they did to the Jews. The third condition is that the observer feels that the mind of the perpetrator is inaccessible. He just can't take his perspective. He just can't figure out why he did that. It looks senseless. It looks something out of the order. And that's why he's shocked to hear about the perpetrator's evil deeds. It's like a shock to his humanity. It makes our mind shakes and our soul shakes with horror. The fourth condition is now, after the act is done, after the evil act is done, the observer looks very carefully to how the perpetrator relates to what he did. And here it can go to two directions. One direction is that the perpetrator does not take any responsibility of what he did, or even accuses the victim. And you can see it a lot. You can hear rapists. There is famous books, you know, and research that interviewed rapists after that. And you can see that the rapists, some of them really accused the victims about their the rape, and said that the woman actually seduced him, and why did she wear this attractive dress, and she's the one to blame. And when the perpetrator talks like that, it's another shock for the observer. He feels traumatized once again, because the perpetrator is like doing it again. He doesn't see what the observer sees. There is no congruency between them. There's no match between them. But there is another direction that it might lead. If the observer is convinced that the perpetrator honestly regrets what he did, in some cases, not in all cases, some cases are the cruelty was such a scale that we are not interested in what the perpetrators has to say. But in some cases, the observer will be more less harsh about the perpetrator. It's like the perpetrator, I don't know why I did it. What did I do? If the perpetrator is shocked like the observer may calm down. It's like the order has how things should be and how humans should behave is restored once again. And what is restored is the faith in humanity within the perpetrator. So these are the four conditions that has to be substantiated in order for us as observer to say that it was evil. But let me add just one more important point. The observer is wrong. To say that the perpetrator is evil is a false attribution. But it's good that he's wrong. From an evolutionary perspective, we should make these mistakes. And I'll explain both things. The observer is wrong because what he attributes to the perpetrator is wrong. When we say that the Nazi is evil, the Germans were evil to the Jews, of course we are right from an objective point of view, but we are wrong in the sense that the Nazis did not see the Jews as helpless victims. They did not see the Jews as the weak side. On the opposite, they saw the Jews as a strong enemy who stabbed the German nation on their back. And because of them caused the defeat of World War I, all the lies that Hitler said about the Jews. So actually the perpetrator and the observer sees two different objects. It's not the same object. It's two different objects. While the observer sees a helpless, defenseless, childlike person or party, the perpetrator sees something very, very different. On the opposite, he sees something many times evil. When you talk to murderers or to rapists, they see themselves as victims. And they see the victim as someone who either provoked them or made something very wrong to elicit their cruel behavior. So the whole set of emotions and cognition that we attribute to evildoers is actually wrong. This is not what went on their mind of the evildoer, of the perpetrator. He did not see a victim there. He thinks that he is the victim. But again, it's good that we have this ability to be wrong, because it it means that we are defending ourselves. If the judge will see in any perpetrator a person, a victim, and see his perspective, he won't be able to judge. We won't be able to differentiate between right or wrong. We won't be able to make any right-wrong judgment. Of course, the perpetrators see things in a very different way than we do. But if we get into our mind and identify with his perspective, we will be morally paralyzed. We won't be able to differentiate between right or wrong. So from an evolutionary perspective, in order to keep us safe and protected and keep our children safe and protected and keep society safe and protected, we must continue to do these mistakes, but we must realize that we have to do it very, very carefully to see all the perspective, to think a lot about it, not to let our emotion pulls us in, but to listen to the full picture. That's what actually they're doing in trial. That's the whole idea of a trial is to do just that, to hear everyone and to see it from the broadest perspective and just then to decide and to judge a right-wrong judgment, to make a right-wrong judgment.
Well, I think you very nicely have delineated how very difficult and complex something like a moral theory can be. And on one hand, I'm left with this notion that ultimately it's how a person, what their early life attachment experiences are like that condition them to perceive the world in certain ways, and that they bring certain perspectives on. On the other hand, we're left with this sense of moral relativism when it comes to each person making judgments, but at the same time, there's a larger ethical objectivity that's operating in society, much like Hegel's notion of objective spirit, where you have the greater ethical social realities and laws that govern and apply toward everyone. And yet the individual's part of that bigger collective. Yeah, and then of course you and I both appreciate the fact when people are traumatized, when they have poor attachments, they have deficit early life experiences or developmental traumas, how their perspective can be totally off kilter from ours. Well, I'm very pleased that you wanted to tell us about your theory, and I can just only imagine you're going to get a great deal of attention and engagement that you deserve. So thank you very much, Aner, for telling us about it.
Thank you, John. It was a pleasure talking to you.